My name is Dave Hansen. I'm from the Authors Alliance. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that is in case you don't know. But just to make sure you're where you want to be, this session is on developing what we're calling the Public Interest Corpus for AI research and development. I was remarking to a couple people, this will be a little bit of a weird Charleston conference session in that you're getting just me. My co-presenter, Thomas Padilla, was unable to make it. For those of you who know Thomas, that's a real loss because Thomas is great and he knows this project really, really well. But I'll try to fill in for him. One little deviation you'll get because of that is I'm probably going to talk to you a lot more about law and policy than Thomas would have. But I think it's actually a pretty important part of this project. So before we get into that, this is the Charleston Code of Conduct, which you probably have seen several times by now, but just a reminder that this exists, and this conference is meant to be an inclusive professional conference, and so be respectful of each other. You can read, oh, I'm sorry, my slides are not showing up. Can we get it switched? There we go. That's the Code of Conduct. So you've seen this a bunch of times, and abide by it, please. Charleston also aims to be an accessible conference. So the main thing here, especially, I really would like to get some conversation and Q&A going. So the main thing about that is let's try to use the mic so that people can hear. All right, so I told you I'd tell you a little bit about Authors Alliance, and the background of Authors Alliance actually is very helpful for understanding the background of this project. We exist, we're an nonprofit that exists to support authors who want to see their works widely disseminated. So our mission is really centered around that, authors who want to see their works widely disseminated for the public good. We do that in a few ways. One is we just educate people about their rights, about copyright. We have a bunch of free legal guides that we publish. We get lots of questions from authors. If there are questions at your institutions, you can send them to us, and we'll try to help them on everything from fair use to publishing contracts to text data mining and AI, which we increasingly hear from people about. The other big thing that we do is we do a lot of advocacy. In particular, we try to show up in litigation in places where authors are going to have a real interest in the outcome of that litigation, but they're not necessarily represented by the parties. And so this is actually this was the very first one that we ever wrote that I was involved with back in 2012, and this was in the Google Books case. And you might remember Google Books was a lawsuit brought by the Authors Guild, different from Authors Alliance, and they had a group of plaintiffs that claimed to represent all US authors with a copyright interest in a book that was digitized by Google. And a bunch of other authors stood up and said, you know what, we think that Google and the university libraries that Google has been working with, they have a pretty strong fair use claim, and what they're doing is good because it actually increases access to our books, it enhances discovery, and it lets people do new interesting things with our works, including applying computational research techniques to our works to make new discoveries. And that's actually been a pretty central thing that Authors Alliance has focused on with researchers over the years. So this is an example of an article, two authors of whom are really closely tied to Authors Alliance, David Baman, who's a text data mining and natural language processing researcher at UC Berkeley, and Rachel Sandberg, who is a copyright lawyer at UC Berkeley. And I highlight this one because this is an example of a project that happened because of a regulation that Authors Alliance really pushed for at the Copyright Office that allows researchers to circumvent DRM on digitally locked up books for the purpose of text data mining and on DVDs. And so they did a study. This one was looking at diversity in Hollywood films, and to do that they had to rip a bunch of DVDs and do some pattern recognition across those DVDs. And they came up with some pretty interesting research showing changes in representation across major films over time. So of course that's interesting in film. That's also, there are also lots of interesting text data mining questions there. Digital humanities folks have asked of books. So this is a screenshot actually from one of the briefs that we filed way back in 2012, 2011, I think this was, in the Google books in the HathiTrust litigation. Because one of the really interesting uses that people could see even then is that with a massive, really, really large-scale corpus of books, you can answer some pretty interesting questions. And so this was one that was highlighted there. It was kind of looking at changes over time in the way certain phrases were used across literature. In particular, this was looking at the United States is versus the United States are. And of course, this has some implications for like how do we understand narratives, American narratives about ourselves and our country. And in particular, this was highlighting some of the changes in phraseology, particularly following the Civil War. Are we a collection of states or are we one nation? So you can answer some really interesting questions when you look at a corpus like this at scale. But since 2012, of course, we've seen that you can do some pretty other amazing things when you have a large corpus of literary works pulled together. And there's like probably, I think every hour here at Charleston, there's like 3 or 4 AI sessions happening. And I know some of you just came from one. On data scraping, because there's just this massive appetite for data for AI training, AI model refinement. Increasingly, we're seeing AI bots being used in other ways, like for AI agents. That's kind of a different use case. But we see this incredible appetite for data for AI. And so one of the things that sort of has shown up in front of me was this appetite for books in particular for AI training. I was starting, I guess about 2 or 3 years ago, starting to get calls from university librarians saying, hey, this tech company that I've never heard of named Anthropic is asking me if they can scan some of my books, or this tech company, OpenAI, that like I've heard of a little bit, wants to do the same thing. And so there's this real appetite for books. And of course, libraries hold the largest collections of books in the world. Research libraries in particular have just massive, deep, well-curated collections of books. And so it started to raise some interesting questions about like how should libraries respond to these overtures for access to their collections? And what's the right pathway forward? So that's basically what the public interest corpus is about. The sort of short version of this that I tell people is it's think of like AI data scraping, but good. And I want to get into like what the good part is. So just a little background, the project is led by Authors Alliance in collaboration with Northeastern University. Dan Cohen is my co-PI on this. And the Mellon Foundation funded us for a year to do this project of trying to investigate what would it look like to really set up a corpus that is going to meaningfully serve the public interest by providing access to library collections, and in particular library book collections. There's a reason why we spread this out over time too, by the way. So most of the project activities have been just talking with stakeholders, having workshops, getting input on what the design of this thing should look like. There's a version of this project that didn't require that. There's a version of this project that just goes to a handful of libraries and says, let's get to work, get some of those big checks from those big tech companies and just start scanning. And one of the reasons why we felt like that was not the right approach, well, there are a few reasons. One is there's some legal stuff to work through there, which we'll get to. But the other reason is you can run ahead and do quite a lot with just providing access to a lot of data all at once. But if we want to design something that's really going to serve the interests of the academic and research community and of the community of people that really want to advance access to knowledge, we need to sit down and just talk about this a little bit, because it's not entirely obvious how to do that, or even that we're all on the same page about what those principles and goals are. So that's kind of where this came from. So this is the project team I already mentioned, Dan Cohen and myself. Thomas Padilla has been working really, done an excellent job on this project, and I'm sorry he can't be here today to talk. And then also Julia Torino, who's a really interesting person, recent PhD grad at Northeastern, working in the digital humanities and trying to help us kind of design a product or a corpus that's actually responsive to researchers' needs. Keeping with the theme of trying to get input from across the community, we have a really great advisory board that has been working with us along the way to try to shape this thing. Folks from some of the largest institutions that have large collections of books that you might imagine would be involved with something like this. Folks like Robin Sloan, New York Times bestselling author, who also kind of understands technology and understands some of the potential value of something like this, while also appreciating that as a creator, you do have sort of a different perspective on how your books are being included in a corpus like this. And there are a few other lawyers in addition to me involved here, because obviously if you go around scanning or using scans of a couple million copyrighted books, you might run into some copyright issues. And we wanted to be careful about how we sifted through that issue. So one of the origins, too, of this project is there was a series of workshops held about 2 years ago by these folks, Paul Keller, Betsy Masiello, Derek Slater, and Alex Turkowski, that focused on, like, what would it look like if we tried to create a books data commons? And it just sort of sketched out at a very high level some principles that would guide an effort like this. So I encourage you to go look up this white paper. It was a really great white paper resulting from this workshop series. And so that prompted me and Dan to write a piece kind of outlining some big questions that need to be answered for figuring out the books issue for AI training. And so this is an op-ed that we wrote. It observed that, you know, if you look at what AI companies are doing to train their models, basically what they're doing is going out on the internet and getting access to whatever they can. You know, if you're not Google, who hasn't had the Google Books project running for 20 years, and have a massive internal corpus of books, you have to start going and looking elsewhere. And that includes looking at places like LibGen and Sci-Hub and other sources online where you might find books, but there might be some downsides to using those books, as we've seen in recent litigation. And not just downsides, by the way, in terms of legal issues, although that's a major one and I think driving a lot of decision making. There's also just a lot of downsides in terms of the quality of the data and the selection of the corpus. So for instance, if you look at Books 3, how many of you have heard of Books 3? This is a data set that is notorious raised in a number of lawsuits. The corpus, it's 183,000 books. If you look at what it's made up of, it's like really weird. If you want to design a corpus that's really pulling from a wide diversity of like well-vetted, long-form argument books. That's not what Books 3 is. Books 3 is like if you really, really wanted an AI model that sounds like Danielle Steele or John Grisham. It's got like a significant bias in that direction. And so, you know, just the design of that corpus is not necessarily great. So this is kind of the upshot of what Dan and I said, is collections should be made available under ethical and fair rules as the raw material that'll enable computationally intense analysis. So this kind of informed where we wanted to go with this project. But it raises a lot of questions, right? Like, in addition to the legal stuff, where I'll get into that, there's just a lot of complicated logistical challenges. Like, is this an organization? Is this a collective? Is this some sort of like federated data repository? How do we govern this? Who gets a stake at the table? Who gets a seat at the table? Is it whoever pays in? Is it whoever has an interest in the works that are being used? How do we even figure out who those people are at scale? And what do we mean by public interest? You know, that was sort of a like pie in the sky thing that we threw in the title and said, well, we want this to serve the public interest. And like everybody thinks that what they do serves the public interest in some sort of roundabout way. And so we realized, you know, that's another thing that we really need to work on and define what we mean about that in this context. And so our primary objective was we want to bring together the expertise of this community to try to think about what it would look like to either maybe establish a new organization or work with an existing organization to try to bring a large-scale digital corpus together that's going to really benefit the public in the AI space. So we've held a number of workshops at this point. We did a really nice really, really cold workshop. This says spring. I think we met in February, and it was like 9 degrees outside in Boston. And then the other workshops were pleasant comparatively from a weather standpoint. We met in New York, and we had a workshop with a pretty large number of researchers. That was one thing that we really wanted to focus on, is how can we design a corpus that's going to incorporate the needs of researchers to make sure it's really responsive to what they're looking for. And to compare that and maybe improve upon previous versions of data access that they've had in other ways that haven't met these needs. And then we recently had our last workshop in Oakland, and this one was a fun one because we actually had something of a model that we were able to put in front of people and then ask, what do you think about this, and what kind of features of this do you think will work and not work, and how can we iterate and improve on that. And so our plan is we're going to publish a startup plan for this. In conjunction with that, I'll be pretty upfront, we're also trying to work right now with kind of the basic bones of the startup plan on figuring out how can we actually make this happen. Can we go to some foundations and try to build together some support so that we can make available this collection in hopefully not a super expensive over-the-top way. So these are some of our workshops. There are some of you in these pictures. Matthew, I think I see the back of your head in one of these, and a couple of other youth. So thanks to those of you who participated in these workshops, because we really did gain a lot of input. These are some of the groups of people. This is our first workshop in Boston. You can see we had a variety of librarians and publishers, researchers, lawyers in the room, authors in the room. And so that was kind of representative of what we had across these different workshops. This is our second workshop in NYU. I know I'm kind of flying through these, but just to give you a flavor of kind of who's been involved along the way to give us input. And this was our last workshop just a couple weeks ago. So we identified a few kind of really big issues of things we needed to figure out. The first is, what are we doing? What are our principles and goals guiding this? Who are these researchers? What are the audiences that we need to reach? How do we pay for this? What's the business model? How do we deal with all of these pesky copyright issues, legal challenges? And then how do we kind of set a trajectory to actually make this productive and happen? So on the principles and goals, this is where we really wanted to spend a lot of time. We got a lot of input from a lot of people. I think what we did in the first workshop, we put this up, the document, we just had a kind of collaborative editing moment. My recollection is that we had something like 300 comments on the document within 15 minutes. And so it was heavily, heavily commented on. We got a lot of different input, some of it conflicting. And so, that's always an interesting thing to kind of figure out how to balance through those. But lots and lots of input from lots of smart people. And we have come up with what I feel like is a pretty good statement about the goals of this project. So I won't read this whole thing to you. This is a lot of text. But the basics of this are that books are really important. Books are really important for AI training, and we've seen that in a number of lawsuits where the AI companies have said as much. I mean, that has shown up in Discovery, where they've talked about the value of books, not just as kind of preliminary training data, but post-training as well, and post-training especially. And so books are really important. Our goal here is that what we really want to do, point number 2 here, is support AI research and development and computational research. One of the ways that you'll see that has come out is in the design of this project is we really want to focus in on academic and academic researchers and their AI use cases. How that relates to the public interest is kind of a 2-step story, right? But the idea is academic researchers produce knowledge, produce things that have broad public benefit, and they're not doing so, for the most part, with a huge profit-seeking motivation behind it that's going to kind of twist and turn some of the outcomes of what they're doing. And so we think, at least at the beginning, the main focus of this needs to be building a corpus for universities, for academic researchers to do their work. You can kind of scan through the rest of these, and you probably are, but those are kind of the key motivating factors behind this. And then these are some of our goals just kind of early about sourcing across small, medium, and large organizations. This is not just about the largest institutions pulling their books together. This also needs to be efficient. We can't afford as a community really bloated, high-touch, intermediary organizations. I mean, I think we're all aware of what's happening in kind of the budget space more generally for libraries right now and universities. And so we need to make this thing relatively efficient as well. So I want to talk about legal risks. I'm looking at my time here. Okay. So we have some goals with legal risks. The really short version of this is don't get sued. Let me move ahead here. Don't get sued is a great objective from a legal perspective. But how do you do that in a way that actually helps serve the needs of researchers when you're talking about trying to provide access to a very large scale corpus of copyrighted books? One is actually the prioritization of academic and research users helps an awful lot with that. The law does make some distinctions between commercial users and academic users. And when we focus on the academic and research community, we have a stronger fair use case, we have stronger protections, and we think that that's a pretty important design feature of this from a risk perspective. Another is that we need to really define what these use cases are and have pretty firm agreements in place with researchers about how they're using the corpus. So, the basic set of issues that we want to focus on are text data mining, AI model refinement, small language model refinement. These are what we've heard from researchers. There are some larger training efforts to the extent that this is useful for that. That's great. Frankly, there's relatively few and far between because it's just so expensive. Few institutions have the compute power to do that in the nonprofit space, but there are some. And then we need to manage that risk in a meaningful way. So one design feature that we've seen emerge here is researchers really can't operate in a model where they have to look at the data through a telescope, where the data resides on one institution's server, and the only way to get access is either travel to that institution or have some sort of remote access in. The scale is large enough. The needs to iteratively work with that data are so significant that researchers really want and frankly need local access to data. And that raises some risks, right? Of if you're transferring large amounts of data from one institution to another, you have to make sure it happens securely. You have to ask lots of questions about what happens with that data when it's now at that host institution. And so, but we think there are pathways to do that, particularly through robust data sharing agreements. And this is not reinventing the wheel here either. Institutions do this all the time, particularly for any of you at institutions with large health sciences programs. Institutions share highly confidential, sensitive data all the time. It's not an easy thing, but there are data sharing agreements that are pretty well vetted as pathways for how to do that. So that's kind of one model that we've been thinking of. So I'm going to zoom through some of the legal stuff. I did have a bunch of slides here on different cases to give you a sense of sort of the trajectory of where this has come from. I apologize because you're going to see a bunch of quotes that you probably won't even have time to read, but just some marker points on the history of this. The courts have routinely said over the years that it is appropriate, it is okay, fair use allows for the use of large-scale copying for transformative uses. That is, uses that take that work and use it for an entirely new purpose and giving it new meaning or message. So this is one example. This is one of the earlier cases called iParadigms. This is about Turnitin.com. Many of you use Turnitin.com, plagiarism detection software tool. And of course, the way that system works is it has a very large corpus of material that it matches submitted papers against to see if it can detect plagiarism. So this is how the court talked about that system. This was back in 2009. This is 16 years ago. The court found that this was transformative fair use because it was really unrelated to the expressive purpose of those papers originally. So the next big marker was Google Books. Google Search, of course, accomplished some similar things. The court talked about how, in particular, the search engine enables new forms of research known as text mining and data mining. It pointed specifically to the Google Ngrams tool and talked about how this was entirely different from the underlying use of those books. I'm going to skip that part for a second. And then HathiTrust had essentially the same kind of conclusion. The court in HathiTrust said, yeah, HathiTrust's enabling of these uses is transformative. It gives rise to new methods of academic inquiry, such as text mining, and in fact cited that brief that I included a little excerpt of before. So that's all nice. And if we go back to 2015 and just kind of ignore everything that's happened since then, we would all feel like warm and fuzzy and like, yes, we can digitize lots of books and we can make it available for computational research. But there's a little bit of litigation happening right now. This is a map of the 52 AI copyright lawsuits that have been filed across the United States. Many of these are really big deal copyright lawsuits. The biggest, most recently, has been the Bart's versus Anthropic suit. This resulted in a $1.5 billion settlement. Although the details of that actually matter quite a bit for this project, because what the settlement was really about is kind of tangential to what libraries would be doing here in terms of building a corpus. So let me talk about that a little bit. Claude is the tool, the AI tool that Anthropic rolled out. And Claude and the various models that Anthropic has trained over time for Claude are built on, among other things, a large number of books. Anthropic used at least 9 million books, maybe more. We don't exactly have the numbers. The filings have been a little fuzzy on this, but a bunch of them they took from sites like LibGen, or this one's hard to deny the sort of illegal focus of it. The Pirate Library Mirror, the name of that one kind of gives it away, and Books 3. But they also went through and got a bunch of books just by buying them. So midway through the project, they said, you know what? We think that we need to go out and buy books and scan them. And so they bought about 2 million books from used bookstores, and they sawed off the spines and they scanned them, which is a whole nother, like, it's kind of impressive to scan 2 million books in like a year and a half, which is what they did. So that was a big lawsuit that was filed. And actually, we have some pretty good news from the AI development angle in that. In that case, the court said that using those materials to train a large language model was fair use. And in fact, the court described it as among the most transformative technologies that many of us will see in our lifetimes. So an extremely strong conclusion on the fair use transformative part of using these materials for training a model. Now, where the settlement came from and why this was a problem for Anthropic was the sourcing of the books. The court said, well, but you downloaded all these things from LibGen. That just looks like straight up piracy. And you didn't have, you weren't necessarily using those copies for this transformative fair use purpose. You're just holding on to them. And so that's what gave rise to potential liability for Anthropic. I'm going to skip through this. Meta had actually a similar case. They used LibGen as well, and the court also concluded that, this looks like transformative fair use here. So I'm skipping ahead a bit, but I wanted to give you a couple of takeaways that I think apply to a project like this. One is the courts have consistently found that non-expressive uses are transformative, including commercial uses, which give us, I think, a little bit of comfort for the nonprofit academic context that, if what they're doing is fair use, then we should actually feel very safe. There is some scrutiny about whether this has a negative effect on the market. Not in the Bart's case, but the Kadri case talked a bit about that, so that's a little unsettled. But again, we're not talking about a commercial context, and actually in that case, the court specifically pointed out research and said that might be an example where this market harm stuff doesn't matter. So overall, the legal situation has shaped up to be pretty favorable for building something like this, as long as you incorporate a couple key design elements, like not letting the data leak out into the world, and have adequate security protecting it. And to ensure that the uses are actually tailored to these kind of computational research uses, AI development uses, and not somebody just kind of ripping off the content and using it for its original expressive purpose. So I'm just going to kind of run through a couple last things here in terms of design features. Of course, in addition to managing risk and finding a pathway through that, you also have to think through, for a project like this, what does the data access and data development look like? Are you handing people raw TIFF files of books? Are you handing them highly processed data with like really high quality metadata associated with it? What does all that look like? What we have found through the project is that for the most part, researchers are not looking for someone to do all of the data processing work for them. They don't want raw TIFFs, but they also don't want someone to spend a crazy amount of time kind of massaging and improving and cleaning the data. And that's not because they're trying to be nice. Actually, what we've heard from most people is when that happens, they don't trust it, or they don't know what the other person did, and so they'd much prefer to have as close to original sourcing as possible as text files, and be able to go off from there. And in terms of data access, that's another question, is how are people interacting with this corpus? For the most part, this was kind of nice to hear because it's actually the lowest cost solution. Most people have said, we just want bulk data access. Like, we don't need you to build an API. APIs are cool. We may be able to build something interesting on top of that. Maybe that's like version 2 of this. But for now, we would really just like to have bulk data access. And so those are a couple of design features that are nice to hear because they don't require an incredible amount of resources to make happen. A couple of last things here. Governance is another issue. How do you govern a project like this? How do you make sure that it kind of stays true to those principles and values? The main piece of research, or sorry, the main piece of feedback that we've gotten on this is don't get too fancy. Don't try to like reinvent nonprofit academic governance. We have really good models for that. We can look to things like HathiTrust, for example, which has a very robust governance model. We want to avoid some pitfalls like what we've seen in some organizations where you have sort of board capture and things go off in weird directions that maybe really diverge from the original founding principles. But the main thing is to have a seat, to have the organizations whose values are driving this, to have a leading seat at the table. And so that's kind of the model that we're building this around. So not rocket science, but again, it has to be addressed. One of the interesting issues here, though, is how do you build in input from people like authors and researchers who aren't necessarily the ones paying for something like this, but do have a real stake in what it looks like. And that's been maybe the most interesting piece of this. And I think what we're going to end up recommending there is that in addition to kind of sort of a core governance structure, there be advisory boards that have pretty significant charges to give input and feedback to the main governance board, made up of people like authors and publishers and researchers. And finally, sustainability. How do you pay for this? So the cop-out answer is we try to get some support early on from grants and get this thing spun up in the short term. And actually that's not really a sustainability plan, but it is a financing plan that I think is important because there's sort of a window here for launching something like this. I think we're kind of at a moment where libraries and universities have an opportunity to do something really interesting here and something that serves their interests before we end up really in an environment where, like in a lot of other areas, the norm and the model is, sorry, you just have to buy that from someone outside. So I think that it's really important to try to spring ahead and get this thing started, but it also needs some sort of sustainable financing Fortunately, the way that it's come together, and I think what we will be proposing, is a relatively lightweight, low-cost model. And so supporting that across a large number of institutions is not as complicated, particularly with a membership model. So the thing I wanted to end on here, and why I think this is important, is the counterfactual of not doing something like this is, I think, pretty bleak. Libraries have these incredible stores of collections that are highly curated, well-developed, incredible metadata. They're gold mines, basically, for people to create new advances in AI and other areas. And if we end up in a world where the training data world is dominated just by commercial publishers and big technology companies that are afford to either handle those $1.5 billion settlements or do massive licensing deals, and that's kind of the entire universe of what's possible, that's not really great, because what we see right now, what I see right now, is academic researchers are at a real disadvantage. They can't go out and just use data sources like LibGen. Their general counsels are not going to let them, because most universities aren't willing to absorb the risk of just going to court and figuring it out later. Even if it is entirely a clean, easy, fair use case, that looks way too risky. This is sort of a moderate risk version of this that gives access to researchers and allows them to have a seat at the table in doing that kind of work in a university setting. So I will stop, and I'm happy to talk, take questions, criticism.